It was in early May 1963, on the silent northern edge of Yellowstone near the Montana line, when the earth beneath my boots began to tremble with a slow, quiet thrum that felt nothing like the usual shifting of heated ground. We rode in before sunrise on faded green trucks, moving past locked park gates, while irritated travelers were turned back with a neat lie about fire danger, even though the air itself felt cold enough to bite the inside of my nose. Yet despite the chill, something in the wind smelled wrong, like a mix of hot metal and rotten eggs carried through drifting bands of thin steam that floated across the road as gently as breath from a sleeping animal. My name means little now. Back then I wore a sergeant rank and believed I knew how to read any stretch of land laid under my feet, but nothing in the basin they sent us into looked like the maps from Fort Lewis. The pines thinned too quickly and the birds cut their voices all at once as if something had warned them. Every few minutes a fall of pale dust drifted from a sky as clear as polished glass, and each fleck melted cold against my skin before leaving a dry patch where it touched. The ground pulsed again under my soles, rising with a steady hum that made every man on my squad shift his stance like we stood on the hull of a slow, deep machine. Before we start, the video hit the subscribe button to support the channel. We made camp just beyond a line of trees that appeared burnt, though there had been no fire that season, and every step I took pressed into soil, warmed from below, as if a hidden furnace pushed heat upward in slow breaths. My men pretended to stay calm, but I noticed their boots never stayed still. We numbered 11 soldiers with 2 civilians trailing behind us. One civilian carried a hard case packed with delicate instruments and glass tubes he checked every other minute. The other civilian never said much and studied us more than the vents, which told me enough about what kind of work he did. The lieutenant circled the perimeter holding a clipboard he barely glanced at. Orders on paper seemed simple: mark the steaming ground, set a light wire fence, keep travelers away. Yet the part we spoke softly among ourselves had nothing to do with fences. It was the shifting smell in the air and how it changed each time the wind turned east or west. We formed a half circle of tents, and the medic checked everyone for headaches or bleeding because command warned of gas pockets. His readings unsettled him, though he tried to keep an even expression. The radio man climbed a small ridge to find a signal, and later said he heard a faint drifting voice that sounded like a man calling distance markers the way old artillery spotters used to, but he could not fix a source. As the sun rose high, the basin still felt strangely dim, like the light moved through water before reaching us. The white dust fell again in thin, quiet flakes and melted across my sleeves before leaving a dry film. The machine gunner brushed some off my shoulder with a shaky laugh. We followed the geologist along a first survey line. He pointed out straight fractures in the rock that looked carved rather than formed by nature. He said the tremors did not spike, but rolled in waves, which he claimed made no sense. The intelligence man wrote every word down. Near a cluster of vents, we found a dead bison without wounds, its hide dusted pale, and its eyes clouded like frozen milk. The lieutenant said to leave it, but I noticed my compass needle swirl in slow, uneven circles each time I stepped close. Later, we placed motion wires and small mapping charges. The soil swallowed the blasts with dull thuds and no spray of dirt, as if the ground drank every shock. With each hour, the hum underfoot gained presence, almost like a slow heartbeat pushing through stone. Small patches of the land shifted warmth up through our boots, and by evening the geysers burst in broken rhythms. Some blasted sideways as if shoved by an unseen force. Ash-like dust drifted down thicker and settled across the tents like thin winter snow. We ate early, then sat close without a fire because of the vents. As darkness fell, the basin grew quieter, yet more awake in a strange way. The dust fall thickened, the hum deepened, and the air cooled around us with each pulse from below. When I finally lay down, I kept my boots on and listened to the steady rhythm rising through the earth. A soft tremor rattled the poles of the tent. The hum shifted sharp for a moment, near forming a tone almost like a distant breath brushing my cheek, though no air moved. I told myself it was wind, even though every tree outside stood motionless. Dawn arrived in a thin, weak light, and the camp looked as if a light snowfall had dusted every rifle pack and boot print. When I brushed the flakes from my sleeve, the cloth felt oddly dry, as though the dust had pulled the moisture out. No man joked this time. We gathered for a cold meal while the medic checked everyone again. A few had mild nosebleeds, which he blamed on the dry air, though he kept staring at the dust on his hands, as if waiting for it to move. The radio man tried reaching command, but every transmission echoed itself a second later, as if played back by a tired voice far away. He switched channels, yet the echo followed. The geologist asked to push deeper into the basin toward the east cluster where he believed the center point lay. We moved out single file, following the warm rising patches of soil, while thin threads of steam crossed our path like slow drifting fingers. The further we walked, the clearer the hum became, until it felt like we stepped across the chest of something enormous buried deep below. Halfway to the vents, we discovered remnants of an older camp, rotted rope and a rusted mess tin half buried in dust. A field dressing wrapper identical to ours lay worn, as if weathered for years, even though the design was new. The medic picked it up and it crumbled in his hand. We continued on in uneasy silence. At the vent line, the sensors clicked erratically, then froze. The steam drifted sideways, though the air stayed still. A tremor rolled beneath us, and a cold breath skimmed the ground, lifting rings of dust that circled our boots before fading away like something beneath us had exhaled. I grabbed the rifleman by the strap of his pack and yanked him upright before he toppled into that trembling pool of gray water, whose surface rippled in a slow, unnatural rhythm that matched the steady hum throbbing beneath our boots. The water carried no scent, yet every ripple looked deliberate, as if stirred by something far below. Once we finished marking the territory, we began the long walk back toward the ridge, yet the land did not look the same. The basin felt stretched wider, as though the ground shifted its own map while our backs were turned. The ridge where the radio man had stood the day before now looked twice the distance it should have been, and the slope of the path curled at an angle none of us remembered. My compass spun several degrees each time I paused to check direction. When we finally reached the ridge, the radio man waved us over with a shaken look. He reported picking up a signal faint, but in crisp English, though spoken in sharp, clipped phrasing like a voice from decades earlier. He said the speaker used old range yardage instead of modern terms, and each attempt he made to record the sound left him with nothing but silence. The only bit captured before it dissolved was a single steady number. Afternoon, light dropped low, and we spent the remaining hours enforcing the wire and preparing to move our fallback point toward a northern grove. The scouting patrol that returned said they found a half-buried concrete slab near the tree line with no markings except a rusted iron hook fixed into one side. The lieutenant ordered that we would examine it the next morning. As the sun settled, strange shadows stretched across the basin in directions that made no sense because they bent away from the angle of the light. Dust drifted in long, delicate lines that seemed to map shapes across the ground, as if the land itself attempted to draw boundaries around us. We turned in early, though not one man felt tired. When I lay in my tent listening to the faint whisper of wind, I noticed the tone of it carried a rhythmic rise and fall that resembled the deep tremor earlier. Dust leaked through the tent seam and touched my cheek with the same cold numbness as the morning frost. I closed my eyes and told myself fear was exaggerating every sound, yet the sensation of being watched lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow in an empty hall. Near dawn, another tremor jarred my cot, snapping me fully awake. The hum grew stronger, like a long, slow breath pressing upward. It matched the same rhythm we felt at the vents. The lieutenant was up before any of us and gathered the squad for a direct march toward the grove. We moved with full packs and ready rifles in a silence heavier than the cold air, because no one wished to draw attention from the land around us. The ground pulsed under each step. At the grove, the trees stood tall but drained of color, and the concrete slab lay at a slanted angle, half sunk into the dirt. I brushed moss away until faint carved lines appeared, not letters but scratches worn into the surface like marks left by a dragged tool. We dug around the slab until we uncovered the sloping top of an old buried doorway. The lieutenant ordered me the medic and a rifleman inside. We lowered ourselves on ropes into a narrow bunker that smelled of old stone and untouched air. Our flashlights revealed ancient bunks rusted along one wall and a torn jacket across a cot that disintegrated when I lifted it. The medic discovered a logbook on a shelf with entries dated back to 1918, written by a cavalry group sent to investigate missing tourists near the northern basin. Their accounts described strange lights above the vents and animals dead without wounds. The final pages mentioned a deep hum that grew stronger each night, and one line read the pit answers thought not sound, then another said seal it or feed it. Before we could discuss it, a tremor shook the bunker, sending dust down like falling ash. Our lights flickered and I felt a cold drift brush past me, though nothing stood there. We climbed out and sealed the slab with rocks. The lieutenant listened to our report with a clenched jaw while the intelligence man quietly took the notebook. The geologist circled more areas on his map and muttered about repeating tremor patterns from previous decades. Near midday, we headed back toward the central basin. Dust fell in thick pulses, melting on contact with skin before leaving the same dry, numb feeling. The geologist placed another sensor at a vent, but the needle locked in place and the instrument turned icy in his hands. We pressed deeper. Steam rose in tall, wavering lines, forming shapes at the edge of vision that resembled people moving through fog, even though none of us dared speak such thoughts aloud. The hum pulsed through my chest with each step. The young rifleman stayed close, grim-faced, eyes wide. He whispered that he heard someone call his name, though no one had spoken. I steadied him and ordered him to keep moving. We reached a fresh crack in the earth that had not existed the day before. A cold, faint glow rose from its depths. The hum was strongest at the edge, and I felt it in my teeth. We marked the crack and headed toward camp. Halfway back, the radio man stopped dead. His headset carried a clear voice, speaking in English, but the tone belonged to another era. Calm, deliberate, and steady as if reading artillery ranges. When the count reached 5, the voice faded. The intelligence man demanded every detail. The radio man repeated it with trembling breath. The lieutenant pushed us forward, wanting to return before dark. Yet when we reached camp, everything appeared slightly off. The tents leaned, though their stakes remained tight. Our cooking gear had grown a fresh rim of dust despite being covered. A low tremor passed beneath us, and the hum deepened like a presence settling just below the surface of the ground. As we ate in silence, a geyser erupted on the far side of the basin, not upward, but sideways, bending in a direction no natural force could explain. Dust fell again, thick and deliberate, drifting through the camp in slow, pulsing breaths. Not one man slept easily. The basin felt as though it watched every movement, waiting for the moment we would understand what lived beneath it. No one spoke about the bunker or the logbook, even though the memory of those final written lines clung to every man like a cold whisper. The youngest rifleman kept glancing toward the vent fields as if listening for some hidden reply from the steam. The medic never moved far from him and watched each reaction with a quiet dread he tried and failed to hide. When night settled, the sky remained clear, but the basin felt darker than any darkness I had known. The shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, bending in directions that did not match the silver light of the moon. Before entering my tent, I checked the perimeter, though the compass spun in slow, drifting circles that offered no confidence. The hum crawled through the soil and up my legs, and settled beneath my ribs like a low heartbeat not my own. When I finally entered the tent, I left my boots on because I did not trust the soil to stay still long enough for rest. The hum felt closer now, almost personal, like something beneath the earth had learned the rhythm of our breathing. Dawn broke thin and gray, and the entire camp lay coated in a heavy layer of dust that looked like ash from a distant fire. When I stepped outside, my boots sank slightly into the softened ground, and the hum pushed upward more clearly than before. The dust clung to the tents, to our rifles, to the cold rations, even settling inside the footprints, left from the night before, as though the basin had covered its own tracks. We broke camp early because the geologist insisted on returning to the deep crack we had discovered the previous day, so he could gather new readings. None of us liked the idea, yet orders were orders, and the lieutenant would not allow hesitation. The young rifleman looked, pale, eyes unfocused, as though he had not slept, yet he said nothing and followed quietly behind the medic. As we moved out, dust rose with every step, forming thin, pale rings that floated in the air before drifting apart in slow spirals. The rings moved with such deliberate slowness that the hair on the back of my neck lifted. It resembled breath, patterned breath. We pushed forward through a basin that once again felt larger than it had the day before, as if the space between the trees and ridges stretched when we blinked. Landmarks no longer aligned with memory. The ridge where the radio man once stood appeared far beyond its rightful position, and the vent lines curved like they had shifted overnight. My compass remained useless, the needle twitching and drifting without pause. When we reached the crack, the faint gray glow still pulsed in slow waves rising from the unseen depths. Each pulse matched the hum beneath us in perfect timing. Even the air turned cold enough to fog our breath, though the daylight still shone above us. The geologist lowered a probe into the crack while muttering to himself. He said the depth reading made no sense because the probe fell straight down longer than any natural fissure. Then the numbers froze as though the device had reached some boundary it could not measure. He lifted the probe with shaking hands and refused to speak another word. We placed fresh markers around the crack, then started toward the western vent line where the next round of soil tests awaited. Steam drifted in long sheets across our path, forming shapes that resembled people moving at the edge of vision, disappearing whenever we turned our heads to look directly. A quiet man in the squad, someone I had never heard complain, whispered that he felt watched. I did not dismiss him because the sensation had taken root in all of us. We moved carefully through a thinning patch of trees where the ground quivered in shallow tremors. Without warning, the earth jolted hard enough to knock several men off balance. A column of white steam erupted beside a fallen trunk, and in that instant the young rifleman was swallowed by the cloud. I lunged into the steam with my arm outstretched, but my hand met nothing but freezing mist. When the cloud thinned, his rifle lay on the ground, its metal icy cold and coated in heavy dust, but the man himself had vanished. No tracks, no slide marks, no sign of movement. The dust lay smooth and undisturbed, as if he had never taken a step on that land. The lieutenant called his name until his voice cracked, yet no answer rose from the vents or the trees or the shifting steam. The medic stood silent, staring into the drifting white, and his hands shook as he wiped them on his trousers. He whispered that we should move, and every man agreed without question. The disappearance hollowed us in a way nothing else could have. As we marched, the radio man stiffened and pressed the headset tight to his ear. He said he heard the missing soldier repeating a fragment of something he had spoken earlier that same morning, yet the voice trailed away before finishing the sentence. The lieutenant took the headset, but the sound had already faded. When we reached the grove again, the intelligence man ordered us to inspect the concrete slab once more. Dust brushed away, easily revealing scratch marks that seemed deeper than they had been the previous day, though none of us had touched the surface. They curved like long grooves dragged by something heavy or deliberate. Farther into the grove, we uncovered a second slab, smaller and broken open, with a rusted metal hatch half buried beside it. When we lifted the hatch, it snapped from age and revealed a shallow pit from which a cold draft rose, carrying the scent of metal and something older than the earth around it. We backed away uneasy. The geologist stared at his map again and whispered that the tremor pattern matched those from 1918 and 1944. But this time the cycle moved faster, as if something beneath the basin had grown accustomed to the rhythm. The intelligence man silenced him with a single look. At camp, the shadows stretched longer than the actual shapes that cast them, and the dust fell in thicker flakes, drifting sideways without wind. The medic checked each of us again, and the radio man reported that the echoes in his headset had sharpened, carrying pieces of our own words twisted out of order. No man slept that night. I remained awake in my tent, watching the dust rise and fall like quiet breathing across the earth. By dawn of the fourth day, the basin felt smaller, tighter, closer, like the land itself had drawn inward around us and waited for us to understand what it wanted us to hear. The geologist spoke in a low, strained voice as he explained that both earlier cycles in 1918 and 1944 had ended with entire sectors of land sealed off and burned into dead ground, and that none of this had appeared in our briefing because someone high above us had already decided what we did not need to know. The lieutenant demanded to know why such reports were hidden, yet the intelligence man only stared at him with that same calm, unblinking certainty that said he had expected this confrontation since the hour we arrived in the basin. He simply asked the geologist to continue. The geologist said the present cycle moved faster than either of the older patterns, as though the source beneath the ground had learned the rhythm of the returning pulses and now anticipated the sequence. The medic stepped forward and said that the white dust drifting over the basin did not match any natural mineral. He said it reacted to moisture like frost, yet it fell from a clear sky and melted cold into the skin before leaving dryness so deep it looked like the flesh had been drained. He tried to remain steady, yet his hands kept brushing against his trousers the way they always did when nerves crept up his spine. The intelligence man listened with the same blank expression, then revealed that our mission contained a hidden directive. He said we were not only here to fence off the basin, we were here to understand how far the cycle reached into the human mind when the anomaly peaked. He said the charges we carried were not simply for mapping the soil. They were meant to open or relieve pressure beneath the vents, though the results of that would be uncertain. The word uncertain hung in the cold air like a sentence without an ending. None of the riflemen liked hearing it. The radio man looked down at the ground and refused to lift his eyes. The lieutenant wanted specifics, yet the intelligence man refused to give more than that we were expected to complete the mission exactly as written in our deployment papers. With no other choice, we moved out again into the basin, whose soil now carried more warmth than the daylight deserved. Dust fell in slow pulses that rose and settled like something breathing beneath the crust. As we walked toward the deeper vent line, the geologist grew quiet and kept checking an instrument whose needles spun between 3 points, repeating the same loop, as though the device itself were caught in a moment that refused to move forward. When I asked what it meant, he whispered that the readings were returning to the same instant, again and again, as if the anomaly had begun folding time in small loops. Before he could say more, a rifleman froze with wide eyes fixed on the mist ahead. He whispered that someone stood inside the steam watching us. I saw nothing but shifting white until he stepped forward, and I had to grab him by the harness and yank him back. The medic checked him and said his skin felt cold as if touched by deep stone and that his pulse was too fast. He said the rifleman heard a voice calling his name, same tone as the voice we heard drifting across the camp in the night. We resumed the march and placed our first set of charges. Each time we planted one, the ground vibrated with a heavier hum and dust lifted in thin circles that floated above our boots. The echo in the radio man's headset changed too. It repeated our transmissions now in a tired voice almost identical to his own, yet slower, as if speaking from a great distance. The lieutenant ordered him to switch channels, but the echo followed every change. When we set the final charge of the day, the ground shuddered and a new crack tore open near our feet. A faint gray light rose from the fissure, and the dust moved in slow circles around it, as if pulled by a deliberate hand. The medic reached out toward the shifting air and jerked back as if struck by a cold pulse. The geologist said the pulse matched the old cycle patterns exactly as if history itself were repeating. The intelligence man wrote this down without even glancing at the vent line. We marched back to camp as the fissure behind us glowed in steady waves. The hum followed us deeper and more certain, as though our presence alone guided its rhythm. By the time we reached the tents, the sky had dimmed even with the sun still hanging above the ridge. The natural light, weakened like it, struggled to reach the ground. We gathered near the center of camp, and no one suggested using lamps, because the darkness felt aware of us in a way flame might provoke. The lieutenant attempted to speak with authority, but his voice shook as he explained that we must complete the final ring of charges before the cycle peaked. The geologist warned that the safe point had already passed, but the lieutenant demanded to know what safe meant. The geologist lowered his head and said both earlier cycles ended in violent changes to the land, sudden fog, dead soldiers listed as victims of extreme weather, and entire units recorded as missing. The intelligence man stepped forward and ordered him to stop sharing unnecessary details, though his voice remained quiet, like he expected panic and had prepared for it. The men looked at each other with the dawning understanding that we were not just containing an anomaly. We were measuring what it did to us. A tremor rolled beneath the camp, lifting dust into the air, which then settled in the same slow, rhythmic beat. The radio man flinched and said the echo in his headset was now replaying our earlier conversations with missing and changed words, as if learning them rather than copying them. We moved to reinforce the northern perimeter. Every rifleman walked with wider spacing, their nerves stretched tight. The hum sharpened in tone, and each pulse struck my ribs with deliberate precision. At the edge of the basin, we discovered a strange hollow in the soil shaped like an empty pool. Dust slid across its surface in perfect rippling waves that changed direction each time the air shifted, or perhaps when something below shifted. The geologist said the shape matched an event from the 1918 report, but the intelligence man cut him off and ordered us onward. The trees grew dense at the northern border, and a cold metallic draft drifted between them. The medic said the smell reminded him of old underground bunkers where air never moved. Beyond the trees, we uncovered another cracked concrete slab, with a scattering of clean, untouched iron nails beside it, as if something had placed them there recently. When I lifted one, it felt cold, almost weightless, and in that moment the ground pulsed hard enough to lift dust into a perfect ring around us. A burst of steam erupted to our right, and inside it, a tall, flickering form appeared for a heartbeat, then vanished. The riflemen raised their weapons, but nothing remained. We pulled back slowly, and the hum changed tone again, deeper, more patient, as if acknowledging our fear. The hum shifted again, deepening from a rolling pulse into a steady beat that reminded me of a slow, deliberate engine turning beneath miles of stone, and the geologist stopped mid-step, saying the pattern matched the final recordings from 1944, just before the last assigned unit disappeared without trace. His voice cracked on that final word, and for a moment none of us moved because the weight of it settled into our bones. When we returned to camp, the tents leaned slightly as if the ground beneath them had changed shape by inches during our absence. Our compasses drifted without rest, and even the metal edges of the mess kits had collected faint dust rings arranged in perfect circles, as though the land had begun marking us the way we had marked it. The lieutenant gathered us and said we would complete the final placement of charges at first light. And although the geologist looked like he wanted to argue, he remained silent with a defeated stare. The intelligence man simply nodded and wrote something brief in his notebook, as if everything had unfolded exactly as he expected. That night, I lay in my tent with my boots on and listened to the hum, which now matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat too closely to feel natural. Dust drifted through a seam above my head, falling in slow, gentle breaths, as if the basin exhaled softly into the darkness. A faint cold brushed my cheek, the same cold that lingered in the bunker and near the fissures, and I could not shake the feeling that something beneath the surface was watching, waiting, measuring. At dawn, the air stood still without wind or birds, and even the geysers remained silent. The hum rose steady through the ground, and the dust fell in thick, heavy pulses matching each beat. The lieutenant led us toward the deeper vents with hard, clipped orders, while the intelligence man watched the basin ahead like someone reading a language the rest of us could not understand. The geologist moved slowly, staring at his instruments and muttering that the numbers no longer followed any natural pattern. We reached the ring of vents just as the first thin light of the sun crept across the horizon. The cracks in the earth had widened overnight, and several had fused into long wedges of open stone glowing with a faint gray shimmer. Steam rose in tall sliding sheets, drifting sideways even though no wind touched our faces. Each time the hum pulsed, the steam shifted, as if responding to a command. We began placing the deeper charges. I drove anchors into the soil, while the medic watched the moving steam with a tight, uneasy grip on his pack. Every step made the earth feel softer beneath our boots, as though only a thin layer separated us from whatever moved below. The hum pressed into my chest with sharper definition, making each breath feel narrow and deliberate. Dust swirled around our feet in small whirling circles that followed us like echoes. The geologist whispered that the cycle had reached its peak. The intelligence man ordered him to keep working. A tremor rippled through the ground, and a tall burst of steam erupted behind us. Inside the mist, a long, narrow shape appeared for a moment, standing perfectly upright before sliding back into the white. A startled rifleman fired a desperate burst, though the lieutenant shouted at him to hold fire. The medic seized the rifleman by the arm, telling him to breathe, though the man kept whispering that something had stared directly at him from the steam. We advanced to the final line of charges. My hands shook as I tightened the last clamp, because metal vibrated under my fingers as though the charges themselves had begun to hum. The radio man attempted once more to call command, though all he received was a stretched echo of our earlier transmissions. When he changed channels, a voice spoke clearly for a moment, calm, tired, steady, speaking a single number followed by a direction exactly like the old artillery reports from decades past. The radio man went pale and said the voice sounded like an older version of his own. We reached the center of the ring as sunlight cut across the vents. A new fissure tore open with a sharp crack, and a cold, heavy draft swept across us, brushing the warmth from our skin. The air felt like something aware and searching settled against our faces, and I felt myself recoil as though touched by intent rather than temperature. The geologist stepped forward, staring into the pulsing gray light below, and whispered that the rhythm was not natural but purposeful. The lieutenant ordered everyone to hold position while the intelligence man pressed him to detonate as soon as the last charge showed full connection. The geologist tried to warn us again, but the ground shook hard enough to drop him to one knee. Steam burst upward from 3 vents at once, and the cold deepened until my breath fogged in the new morning light. The radio man shouted that the signal line was complete, and the lieutenant gave the order. The charges ignited across the basin in a rising chain of thuds that rolled like distant thunder. The ground heaved beneath us, and a ring of dull flashes flared across the vents. The hum fractured into a long-drawn pulse like the slow waking breath of something enormous. The basin cracked wide open, and gray light rose from the center like fog lit from within. Every piece of metal on us vibrated. My dog tags rattled against my chest, and the rifles hummed in our hands. Dust lifted into a tight spiral above the cracked earth. Steam surged upward, and within it we heard voices broken and stretched through the mist. Some sounded like men calling ranges. Some sounded like the missing soldier. Some sounded like distorted versions of ourselves. The ground lurched again, and steam walls rose around the fissure. The lieutenant shouted for us to hold the perimeter, though several men stumbled backward. The geologist ran toward the center, clutching his notes with desperate reverence, as if the answer he sought all along had revealed itself in the light. The medic reached to stop him, but the geologist kept going, eyes fixed on the glow. The intelligence man yelled not to fall back, claiming the anomaly had to be measured, not avoided. Yet the hum sharpened until I felt it in my teeth, and something tall shifted in the steam, leaning forward as though listening to us. The dust circled our boots in patient spirals, and every pulse of the ground felt deliberate, as if the basin had turned its full attention upon us and waited for the next moment to breathe. The shaking continued in short, steady pulses that rolled through the ground like the slow breathing of something vast and unseen beneath our boots, and each step felt uncertain, as though the soil itself waited for our next move. Dust lifted in thin waves, rising and sinking in perfect rhythm with the hum that now lived in our legs and chests. The lieutenant shouted for the unit to regroup at the old ridge line, but the steam thickened around us into tall drifting curtains that folded over themselves and hid the men on either side of me. Shapes appeared inside the mist, moving with slow intention, not lingering long enough to be recognized, yet close enough that each man felt watched. Through the shifting white, we saw the geologist standing dangerously close to the central fissure, holding his notes tightly as the gray light washed across his face. He stared downward with a strange calm, as if the glow revealed answers he had chased for years. I called to him, but he did not answer. The medic ran toward him, and I followed while the air grew colder around us. My breath turned to fog with each exhale. When we reached him, he whispered that the cycle beneath the basin was older than any known record, and that the pulses answered thought, not sound. Before he could say more, the fissure widened slightly, and the ground dropped beneath his heel. He leaned forward as if drawn by a quiet pull from the depths, yet I seized his harness, and the medic grabbed his arm, and after a long, tense moment, his body jolted in fear as the hum surged through the earth with a sharp bite. We dragged him back from the edge. Behind us, the lieutenant attempted to form a defensive line, but the riflemen could not keep steady footing as the ground rose and fell in slow waves. Steam walls drifted between them, breaking their formation. The intelligence man stood at the center yelling that we had to hold position for the next readings and that the anomaly was reaching its full peak and would never reveal itself like this again. A vent exploded behind him, and the blast knocked up dust and gray vapor. When the cloud passed, he turned in a slow circle, staring into the mist, as though something had whispered directly into his thoughts. He ordered us not to move and claimed the basin would stabilize if we maintained position. None of us believed him after the missing riflemen and the impossible echoes in the radio and the shifting shapes in the steam. The radio man shouted that the echoes in his headset had begun repeating our words before we even spoke them. Some lines returned stretched thin, some returned broken, some returned altered. He ripped the headset from his skull and threw it to the ground. Then the hum changed tone again, slowing into a long, deep heartbeat that seemed to rise from miles below. Dust lifted in tight rings around our boots. The steam leaned toward us like breath moving through a narrow stone corridor. Tall, narrow figures flickered in the vapor, some resembling men, some resembling twisted animals, some shifting between both. The lieutenant ordered a retreat to the tree line. The intelligence man tried to overrule him, but not a single soldier obeyed him now. The formation crumbled as the riflemen fell back over the trembling ground. The medic pulled the geologist with him. The radio man remained close beside me, clutching the dead headset in both hands, as though expecting it to speak again. When I looked back toward the vents, I saw the fissure widening, and the gray light rising higher in slow, pulsing waves like the surface of a silent ocean deep beneath stone. The hum answered each wave with precise rhythm. Then something in the back of my mind shifted. The logbook from the bunker flickered across my memory. Seal it or feed it. The charges we placed had opened far more than they had closed. I knew what had to be done even before the thought finished forming. I ordered the medic and radio man to get the others to the tree line, while I ran in the opposite direction toward the fissure with the last pack of charges strapped to my back. The ground shook harder, and the steam wrapped around me like white cloth. Dust spiraled upward in tall, winding threads. The hum grew so sharp my ribs ached. Shapes moved inside the steam shadows, tall and patient, watching without sound. When I reached the fissure, cold air, rising from below, struck my face like the breath of something old and aware. I knelt and began setting the charges, my hands trembling from cold and fear and vibration. The soil felt thin beneath me, almost hollow. The dust clung to my sleeves and boots like pale ash. A long shadow passed behind me and lingered in the corner of my sight. I refused to look at it. I finished the line and backed away step by careful step while the fissure pulsed like a giant lung. Dust circled my legs in patient spirals. Without waiting for another tremor, I detonated the charges. The blast tore through the ridge, and a massive slab of earth collapsed into the fissure, folding the gray light inward. The hum broke into a long, heavy rumble that echoed across the basin. The steam walls shivered and sank. The shapes inside them flickered once, then vanished altogether. Dust drifted gently down as though settling into silence. Behind me, the others shouted my name. Their voices carried clearly for the first time in days, as though whatever had pressed against the air had loosened. I stepped back from the sealed fissure and felt the ground steady beneath my boots. The hum remained, but deeper and distant, like something forced far below the reach of daylight. We moved out of the basin slowly with the lieutenant leading the way through the thinning steam. Dust still drifted in soft flakes, yet each pulse felt lighter as though the land no longer pushed it with intention. The gray shimmer faded behind the collapsed ridge, and only weak threads of steam rose into the sky. The medic stayed close to the geologist, who walked silently without lifting his head. The radio man lifted his headset once more, yet only static hissed through it. No echoes, no voices, no strange patterns. We reached the tree line and stood for a long moment in silence, letting the still cold wind move between us. For the first time in days, I felt no hum under my ribs, only quiet. Yet the quiet felt just as unsettling, because it carried the unmistakable weight of something waiting for a reason to rise again. We marched toward the old access road, carrying only what gear we truly needed, because no man wished to remain in the basin longer than required, and each step away felt like stepping out of a dream that had nearly learned how to breathe on its own. The intelligence man walked behind us, scribbling short notes in his book, without once glancing up at the wounded ground we left behind. Nothing about his manner suggested fear. Only irritation lingered in his eyes, as if the anomaly had not provided the complete data he expected. At one point, he stopped and looked back toward the vents with a strange stillness, like he sensed some unfinished call drifting from the steaming ridges. Then he closed the notebook and followed us without a word. The walk felt longer than our arrival, even though the route had not changed. The trees pressed in close, and the shadows under their branches reached across the dirt track like clawed hands stretching for our boots. Every sound made us flinch. Even the snap of a twig beneath a heel sent hearts pounding. The medic claimed it was natural after prolonged stress, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He kept flexing his fingers and studying the skin, as though expecting the cold numbness from the dust to return. We reached the service road by early afternoon and found a convoy waiting. Several unmarked trucks and men in plain coats stood there, offering no salute and no recognition, as if we were ghosts returning from a place no one wished to admit existed. They ushered us inside the trucks without speaking. The lieutenant attempted to report casualties, but a man in a plain coat interrupted him and told him to save it for later. The doors closed, the convoy rolled out, and through the slits in the truck walls I watched the trees thin, and the basin disappear behind them like a memory dissolving into empty distance. At the airfield, medical crews lined us up and took blood samples, checked our eyes, asked quick questions, and wrote down answers without explaining anything. One doctor placed a cold hand on my wrist and asked if I still felt any vibration under the skin. I told him no, and it was true on the surface, though a faint whisper of the hum remained deeper inside, a place I could not reach. They moved us into a room with metal walls and told us to wait. Hours passed in a silence too heavy for conversation. The geologist sat with his head down, his notes gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who realized knowledge had come with a cost he had never meant to pay. The radio man stared at his headset on the table as though it might speak again. The medic sat back, eyes closed, his face lined with exhaustion deeper than lack of sleep. When a major entered the room, he carried a file too thin to hold the truth. He told us the basin would be officially documented as a geothermal accident. He said the missing men would be listed as victims of unstable ground. He said our charges had caused a collapse that disrupted local readings. His tone was calm and detached, like reading from a weather bulletin instead of erasing the truth of what happened. The lieutenant demanded to know what we should put in our reports. The major said our statements had already been written for us, and he placed a stack of prepared papers on the table. The intelligence man encouraged us to sign them with a quiet, almost polite tone. I read the first lines. Not a single word matched what we had lived. The script removed the hum, the dust, the voices, the strange distortions of the land, and every impossible moment we had witnessed. It removed the missing soldiers as if they had never existed. The lieutenant signed first because he knew resistance would go nowhere. The rest followed with reluctant hands. When the paper reached me, I hesitated because the memory of the land breathing beneath my boots clung to me with a weight almost physical. Yet in the end, I signed as well, because the truth would not be accepted by anyone beyond that metal room. After signing, they separated us into individual bunks and told us to rest. The lights dimmed and the hallway fell silent. When I lay back on the cot, The complete absence of the hum made the room feel hollow. The base felt normal, yet it was impossible for me to believe in that normalcy again. During the late hours when everything settled into stillness, I closed my eyes and felt a faint, almost imperceptible echo deep in the middle of my chest, as if the basin breathed one last slow reminder. Days later, they released us in small groups. No ceremony, no recognition, only brief dismissals and distant gazes. The lieutenant received new orders. The medic was reassigned to a hospital unit. The radio man remained for further testing. The geologist left with the intelligence man in a separate vehicle, and none of us dared ask where they were going. I returned to my home station at Fort Lewis, where daily life fell back into its usual rhythm, but mine never aligned with it again. At night, I sometimes felt the faint echo of that hum beneath my ribs, a slow, distant beat that surfaced only when silence deepened. I avoided discussing the mission not because of the forms we signed, but because I knew no one would understand that the land in that basin had moved with purpose. That the dust had drifted in breaths, that the steam had listened, that the hum had waited. Weeks later, a small line in a local paper mentioned a temporary closure in Yellowstone for routine maintenance with no details or location. I clipped the article and kept it folded. More notices followed through the years: trail closures, strange steam bursts, occasional disappearances, always in the same region, though never officially linked. I never returned to the park. I never needed to. The basin lived inside me like an echo beneath the surface of thought. I kept all the clippings in a small box, and sometimes in the quiet of night I opened it and felt a soft, cold drift along my wrist, the same cold that once rose from the fissure. I grew old carrying that memory. Most of the men who survived that mission are gone now, yet I remain with the faint, steady rhythm that surfaces when the world falls silent. I do not know if the cycle we interrupted has ended or merely slowed. I only know what I felt under my boots. When night stills and the house draws in a breath, I sense a slow, patient echo rising from some deep chamber of the earth, as if the basin remembers us and waits for the next time it decides to breathe again. If you made it this far, then you already know the truth. Some stories stay buried because the ground itself wants them quiet. What happened in Yellowstone in 1963 did not end. It only went deeper. And somewhere out there, that slow, cold heartbeat still waits for the next man who steps too close. If you want more hidden missions and dark war files, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And if you think you can handle it, check out the other stories showing on your screen right now. Captain Rebel out.